The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning. Certified mail, requiring a signature. Anya Petrova signed for it, with the same graceful penmanship she'd used on countless documents over the past 3 years. Documents she'd barely read. Documents she trusted implicitly because they came from Marcus. She made coffee, French press, the expensive beans Marcus had introduced her to, back when his credit card paid for everything. She sat at her small kitchen table in the apartment he'd gifted her, though the deed, she'd later discover, was held in a labyrinthine trust she didn't understand. The morning light filtered through gauze curtains, and for a moment, everything felt normal. Then she opened the envelope. Citizens Commercial Bank. Official letterhead. Legal size. The paper was heavy, expensive, the kind that announced importance before a single word was read. Notice of default and personal guarantee enforcement. The words blurred. Anya blinked, her pulse suddenly loud in her ears. She read the first paragraph, then the second. Then she went back and read them again, certain she'd misunderstood. This letter serves as formal notification that the undersigned borrower, Anya Petrova Social Security number XXXXX 4721, has defaulted on a commercial loan facility in the amount of $20 million, extended to Vance Industries, LLC. Per the personal guarantee agreement, executed on the 14th of March 2022, you are hereby notified of your personal liability for the full outstanding principal, accrued interest, late fees, and associated legal costs, totaling $23,847,392.18 as of the date of this letter. The coffee cup slipped from her fingers. It shattered on the tile floor, brown liquid spreading in a dark pool that looked disturbingly like blood. $20 million, her name, her signature. Anya's hands shook as she flipped through the attached documents. There it was, a photocopy of a personal guarantee agreement, dated nearly 3 years ago. Her signature at the bottom, next to Marcus's elaborate scrawl. She remembered that day, vaguely. They'd been in his office, the one with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the San Francisco Bay. He'd slid a stack of papers across his mahogany desk. "Just formalities, darling," he'd said, his voice smooth as aged whiskey. "Investment documents for the partnership. You're a board member now. We need your signature on file for the bank." Standard procedure. She'd signed. Of course she'd signed. She'd signed everything Marcus put in front of her, because he was her mentor, her lover, her gateway to a world she'd only dreamed of accessing. Now that signature was going to destroy her. 18 months earlier, Anya Petrova had been 26 years old, and brilliant in the way that didn't matter. In Silicon Valley, technically gifted, but lacking the pedigree, the connections, the ruthless confidence that opened doors. She'd graduated from San Jose State, not Stanford. She'd worked at a mid-tier software company, writing elegant code that no one important ever noticed. Her annual salary was $94,000, which felt like wealth until she looked at San Francisco rent prices. Then her grandmother died. Grandma Petrova had been a Ukrainian immigrant who'd cleaned houses for 50 years and saved every penny with the fierce discipline of someone who remembered real poverty. She left Anya $340,000. Not enough to retire on, but enough to change everything. Enough to invest. Enough to take risks. Anya attended a tech conference that November, using part of her inheritance to buy a VIP pass. That's where she met Marcus Vance. He was 52 years old, though he looked younger. Personal trainers, quality skincare, and the kind of confidence that came from 3 decades of winning. His companies had been profiled in Wired and TechCrunch. He'd made his first fortune in cloud infrastructure in the early 2000s, then pivoted to AI and IoT. Vance Industries was his umbrella corporation, with tentacles in a dozen sectors. She'd been standing alone at the cocktail reception, nursing an overpriced drink, when he approached. "You wrote the Kalman filter optimization for Synthex's data pipeline, didn't you?" She'd turned, startled. Yes. How did you?" "I read commit logs for fun." His smile was disarming, self-deprecating. I know. I'm a terrible person. But that implementation was brilliant. Whoever wrote it understands the mathematics at a level most engineers fake. They talked for 2 hours. He'd asked about her work, her ideas, her dreams. He'd listened, actually listened in a way that made her feel seen for the first time in her professional life. When the reception ended, he'd handed her his card. I'm always looking for exceptional talent. Come by my office. Let's talk about what you could build if you had real resources. She'd gone to his office the following week. The building in Insomnia was all glass and steel, the kind of place where the coffee was free and came from an imported Italian machine. Marcus's office occupied the entire top floor. He'd given her a tour of his current projects, a logistics optimization platform, a machine learning framework for financial modeling, an IoT security protocol. This is incredible, she'd breathed, examining the code architecture on his screens. It could be better. It could be revolutionary, with the right mind working on it. He'd looked at her directly. I'd like that mind to be yours. The offer was intoxicating. A position as a senior architect, equity in the company, and most seductively, his personal mentorship. But there was something else in the offer. Something unspoken in the way his eyes lingered, in the proximity he maintained when explaining technical concepts. The first dinner was ostensibly about discussing her role in the company. The second was at a Michelin-starred restaurant. By the third, the pretense had fallen away. I find you captivating, he'd said over champagne that cost more than her monthly rent. Not just your mind, though that's extraordinary. Everything about you. She should have been cautious. She should have recognized the power imbalance, the calculated seduction. But she was 26 and brilliant and invisible. And here was a man who saw her, who valued her, who promised to elevate her to heights she'd never imagined. The relationship evolved into something that had no clean label. He paid for everything, her apartment lease, her wardrobe, her travel. In return, she was available when he needed her. For dinners with investors, for weekends at his Napa estate, for late-night strategy sessions that blurred the line between business and pleasure. Think of it as a partnership, he'd explained. I invest in you, you invest your brilliance in my companies. We both win. The sex was good, but transactional, with the same calculated efficiency Marcus applied to business deals. Afterward, he'd discuss market strategies, competitor movements, his hand absently stroking her hair, as if she were both lover and particularly pleasant pet. 6 months into their arrangement, he'd brought up her inheritance. You're still keeping it in a savings account. He'd laughed, not unkindly. Darling, that's financial suicide. Inflation alone is eating 7% annually. You're losing money. I know, but I don't know where to invest it. The stock market feels risky right now, because you're thinking like an amateur. Let me show you how wealth really builds wealth. He'd introduced her to his world of private equity, venture capital, and pre-IPO investments. He'd shown her returns of 30%, 50%, sometimes 200%, and then he'd made the pitch. I'm incubating a new subsidiary, AI-driven logistics optimization. The market is underserved, and we have proprietary algorithms that will dominate once we scale. I'm bringing in select early investors, people I trust, people who'll benefit from ground floor equity. How much are you looking for? The round is capped at $5 million. I'm offering you a chance to come in at $250,000 for a 2% stake. When we go to Series A next year, that stake will be worth at least $2 million. Conservative estimate. She'd hesitated, but only briefly. Marcus had never steered her wrong. He'd opened doors, introduced her to people, taught her things no university could. Saying no felt like rejecting not just an investment opportunity, but their entire relationship. I'm in, she'd said. The paperwork arrived a week later, delivered by courier to her apartment. Marcus called as she was reviewing it. I know it looks like a lot, he said. Legal has a tendency to overdocument. But I need you to be an official board member of the holding company. It's a legal requirement for investors at your level. Just formalities. Sign everything where you see the tabs. There were 47 pages. She signed them all. Her $250,000 investment became $340,000 when Marcus convinced her to maximize the opportunity by investing her entire inheritance. This is your moment, Anya. Don't leave money on the table. She'd signed that paperwork too. Present day, Anya sat on her kitchen floor, surrounded by broken porcelain and cold coffee, rereading the default notice for the 5th time. The words hadn't changed. $20 million. Her name. Her signature. She called Marcus. His cell went straight to voicemail. Not the normal voicemail greeting, but a robotic voice, informing her the number was no longer in service. She called his office. The receptionist's voice was clipped, stressed. Mr. Vance is unavailable indefinitely. All inquiries should be directed to our legal counsel. This is Anya Petrova. I need to speak with him about a personal matter. It's urgent. Ma'am, Mr. Vance is not available. I can transfer you to. Where is he? I'm not at liberty to say. Would you like the number for legal? Anya hung up. Her hands were still shaking. She forced herself to breathe slowly, to think through the panic. She called the bank. After 40 minutes on hold and 3 transfers, she reached someone in the commercial lending collections department. I received a default notice, Anya said, keeping her voice steady. There must be a mistake. I didn't take out a $20 million loan. The loan was extended to Vance Industries, LLC, Miss Petrova. You signed a personal guarantee. Do you dispute your signature? I don't remember signing this. The document is notarized. Dated the 14th of March, 2022. If you're claiming fraud, you'll need to file a police report and provide documentation. In the meantime, the debt remains enforceable. We've already begun proceedings to place liens on your assets. Do you have legal representation? No. I need time to. You have 30 days to respond to the notice before we proceed with garnishment and asset seizure. I'd recommend retaining counsel immediately, Miss Petrova. The line went dead. Anya pulled a laptop from her bag, with trembling fingers, and began searching. Vance Industries default. The results were immediate and devastating. TechCrunch. Vance Industries files. Chapter 11. Citing liquidity crisis. Bloomberg. Marcus Vance's empire crumbles as creditors. Circle San Francisco Business Times. Former tech darling faces multiple lawsuits as companies collapse. She clicked the first article. It had been published 3 days ago. Vance Industries, once valued at $340 million, has filed for bankruptcy protection after a series of failed ventures and alleged financial mismanagement. Creditors claim the company diverted funds from operational accounts to prop up failing subsidiaries, leaving a trail of unpaid debts exceeding $200 million. Founder and CEO Marcus Vance could not be reached for comment. Anya read article after article, each painting the same picture. Marcus had been running a shell game, moving money between subsidiaries, taking out loans to pay previous loans, cooking the books to maintain the illusion of solvency. And when the house of cards finally collapsed, he'd vanished, leaving her holding a $20 million bag. She searched for her investment, the AI logistics company that was supposed to make her rich. The subsidiary didn't exist. The company name she'd invested in, Vance Optimization Solutions, LLC, appeared nowhere in any corporate filings. Her $340,000 had simply vanished into the maw of Marcus's collapsing empire. Her phone rang. Unknown number. She answered. Miss Petrova? This is David Chen, from Whitmore & Associates. We represent Citizens Commercial Bank. I understand you received our default notice. I didn't take out that loan. You signed a personal guarantee. That makes you legally liable, regardless of whether you directly received the funds. We're prepared to pursue all available remedies, including asset seizure, wage garnishment, and civil litigation. However, if you're willing to discuss a settlement, I don't have $20 million. I don't have $2 million. I don't have anything. Then we'll pursue bankruptcy proceedings. The process will be faster if you cooperate. I'll have my paralegal send over the paperwork. He hung up before she could respond. Anya sat in the spreading silence of her apartment, the apartment that wasn't really hers, that would be seized along with everything else, and felt something crack inside her. Not breaking entirely, not shattering into despair, but fracturing, in a way that let something cold and dark seep through. Marcus Vance had used her. He'd seduced her, isolated her, made her dependent on him, and then weaponized her trust to shield himself from his own failures. He'd left her to drown while he disappeared into whatever golden parachute he'd prepared for himself. She stood, glass crunching under her feet, and walked to the window. The San Francisco skyline glittered in the afternoon sun. Towers of glass and steel, where men like Marcus made fortunes, by destroying people like her. Not anymore. Anya didn't cry. She didn't call friends or family. She didn't collapse into the paralysis of victimhood. Instead, she went to her bedroom and began methodically searching through the boxes she'd never fully unpacked, boxes of papers and belongings from Marcus's office that he'd asked her to hold on to during one of his many reorganizations. If Marcus Vance thought she was just another disposable woman he could sacrifice to save himself, he was about to learn exactly how wrong he was. She would find him. She would understand how he'd destroyed her. And then she would use every weapon he'd ever taught her to do the same to him. Only she would do it better. 3 days after the default notice arrived, Anya's bank account was frozen. She discovered it at a coffee shop, trying to buy a $5 latte with her debit card. The transaction declined. She tried again. Declined. The barista, a tattooed girl who'd served her 100 times before, looked away awkwardly. "Sorry, do you have cash?" Anya didn't. She left without the coffee, her face burning. At home, she logged into her bank account and found the hold notice. Account frozen, pending resolution of outstanding legal claims. For information, contact. The phone number led to an automated system that transferred her to the same collections department that was destroying her life. She had $247 in cash, hidden in a drawer, emergency money her grandmother had taught her to keep. That was it. Everything else was locked behind legal proceedings she didn't understand. Her credit score, which had been 781 a week ago, was now flagged with multiple inquiries and a default notation. Her phone buzzed constantly with calls from unknown numbers, debt collectors, lawyers, process servers. She stopped answering. The eviction notice came on Friday. Her landlord, apologetic but firm, explained that the trust holding her apartment lease had been dissolved, the payments had stopped, and the property was being foreclosed. She had 30 days to vacate, 30 days to pack up her life and move to where, with what money. Anya spent the weekend in a fugue state, mechanically packing her belongings into boxes while researching Marcus Vance's whereabouts. The internet offered only fragments and speculation. His houses, the Pacific Heights mansion, the Napa estate, the Lake Tahoe retreat were all dark, emptied of staff. His company's offices were locked, with notices from bankruptcy trustees on the doors. His phone numbers were disconnected. His social media accounts had gone silent. One article mentioned that he'd been spotted at SFO 3 days before the bankruptcy filing, boarding a private jet. Destination unknown. He'd planned his escape meticulously, she realized. While she'd been sleeping beside him, trusting him, loving him in her way, he'd been constructing an exit strategy that left her holding his debts while he vanished into whatever jurisdiction wouldn't extradite him. On Monday, she received a letter from a law firm representing 3 other creditors, former employees suing for unpaid wages, vendors demanding payment for services, investors claiming fraud. They wanted her deposition. They wanted her to testify about Marcus's business practices, about the financial documents she'd signed, about the structure of the companies. She was being positioned as a co-conspirator, not a victim. That night, she returned to the boxes of Marcus's papers she'd been searching through. Most were mundane old contracts, marketing materials, strategy memos, but she was looking for something specific, something she remembered seeing years ago. Marcus had complained about it during one of their dinners, rubbing his wrist dramatically. "I sign my name 300 times a week," he'd said. "Do you know what that does to your hand? I had a stamp made. Cost a fortune. But it's perfect, replicates my signature, exactly. My assistant can handle routine documents without bothering me." She'd laughed at the time, teasing him about being too important to sign his own name. Now she needed to find that stamp. It took her until 2 a.m. to locate it. The box was labeled Office Misc, the kind of box packed hastily during a move, filled with desk drawer detritus. There were pens, business cards, a Mont Blanc fountain pen, expensive, forgotten, paper clips, and at the bottom, wrapped in a cloth napkin, a small rectangular object. She unwrapped it carefully. The stamp was custom-made, mounted on a rosewood handle. The rubber impression was Marcus Vance's signature, in perfect detail, every loop and flourish captured. She pressed it against a piece of scrap paper. The impression was immaculate, indistinguishable from his actual handwriting. Anya held the stamp in her palm, feeling its weight. Marcus had used it thousands of times to authorize documents, to sign contracts, to bind his companies to legal obligations. It was a tool of power, the physical manifestation of his authority. And he'd forgotten it existed. Or maybe he'd thought it didn't matter anymore, not when he was planning to abandon everything anyway. She wrapped it carefully and placed it in her purse. Then she sat at her laptop and began making lists. What I know. Marcus used my signature to guarantee a $20M loan. He diverted that money into his failing companies. He planned his bankruptcy and disappearance. I'm legally liable for his debts. My life is destroyed. What I need. Legal knowledge, corporate law, bankruptcy, debt instruments, financial knowledge, how money moves, how assets hide, access to information about Marcus's remaining assets, a strategy to transfer liability back to him, time what I have. His signature stamp, $247 in cash. 30 days before eviction. Nothing to lose. The last item was the most important. When you've already lost everything, risk becomes irrelevant. She had no career to protect her association with Vance. Industries had made her toxic in the tech world. She had no assets to preserve, they'd already been seized. She had no reputation to maintain, she was already being positioned as either a fraud victim or a co-conspirator. What she had was rage, brilliance, and a dead man's signature. That would have to be enough. The next morning, Anya withdrew her $247 in cash, closed what remained of her accounts, and began systematically erasing her digital footprint. She deactivated social media accounts, changed her phone number, and set up forwarding addresses through mail services. If she was going to fight back, she couldn't be easily found. She packed her remaining belongings into a storage unit she paid for with her last cash, keeping only what fit in 2 suitcases and a backpack. Then she bought a bus ticket to Sacramento with the $80 she had left. Not San Francisco, not the Bay Area, somewhere cheaper, somewhere she could disappear and rebuild. The bus ride took 3 hours. She spent them researching bankruptcy law on her laptop, using the bus's spotty Wi-Fi to download everything she could find about debt instruments, corporate structure, and asset protection. The reading was dense, written in legal language designed to obscure rather than clarify, but she forced herself to parse every word. She learned about Novation, the legal transfer of contractual obligations from one party to another. She learned about debt assumption agreements and corporate guarantees. She learned about the intricate ways that companies shield assets through holding companies, subsidiaries, and offshore trusts. Most importantly, she learned that signatures legal, notarized signatures, were the linchpin of all of it. A signature wasn't just a name written in ink. It was a binding commitment, a legal assertion of intent, a tool that could create or destroy fortunes. Sacramento was grey and hot when she arrived. She found a weekly rate motel near the state capitol, $180 per week. Cash. No questions asked. The room was small and smelled of old cigarettes, but it had Wi-Fi and a door that locked. It would do. That evening, she walked through downtown until she found what she was looking for. A small, aggressive law firm with a name that sounded like a weapon. Thorne and Associates, corporate litigation, asset recovery, bankruptcy. The office was in a converted Victorian, painted dark blue with gold lettering. Through the window, she could see a woman in her 50s working late, bent over documents at a desk piled with file folders. Anya watched for a long time, studying the woman's focused intensity, the way she attacked paperwork with a red pen, slashing through language with surgical precision. That was her new mentor, she decided, whether the woman knew it or not. The next morning, Anya returned to the office at 9 a.m. sharp. The receptionist was a young man with an undercut and ironic glasses. "Do you have an appointment? I'm here about the paralegal position." "We're not." "You are now." Anya pulled out a folder she'd prepared. Inside was her resume, edited to emphasize her analytical skills and attention to detail. With her tech background reframed as corporate research and documentation, she'd also included a writing sample, a 5-page analysis of a recent bankruptcy case she'd found online, dissecting the legal strategy with the same precision she'd once applied to debugging code. The receptionist glanced at it, skeptically. "I'll give it to Eleanor, but I'll wait." She sat in the small lobby for 3 hours. At noon, the woman she'd seen through the window the night before emerged from a back office. She was striking in a severe way, silver hair pulled back tightly, sharp features, expensive suit that hung on a thin frame. She looked at Anya with the assessing gaze of someone who sized up opponents for a living. "Eleanor Thorne, you're the one who wants to be a paralegal? I'm the one who will make your firm more efficient and more profitable." A flicker of amusement crossed Eleanor's face. "Bold claim. What makes you think you're qualified?" "Your resume says software engineering. I find patterns in complex systems. I optimize processes. I work 80-hour weeks without complaint. The only difference between code and legal documents is syntax. Legal work requires precision. So does engineering. A misplaced semicolon crashes the entire system. I imagine a misplaced clause does the same in a contract." Eleanor studied her for a long moment. "Why do you want this job?" "You could make 3 times the salary in tech." Anya met her gaze steadily. "I need to understand how corporate law works. I need to learn from someone who wins. And I need to do it fast." "Why?" "Because someone used legal documents to destroy my life, and I intend to return the favor." Eleanor's expression didn't change. But something shifted in her eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or respect. $20 an hour, 70-hour weeks. You'll do grunt work, filing, research, document review. If you screw up, you're gone. If you learn fast, we'll talk about a raise in 6 months. I'll take it. You start tomorrow. Don't be late." Anya wasn't late. She arrived at 7 a.m. and stayed until midnight. She filed documents and learned how they were structured. She researched case law and learned how arguments were built. She reviewed contracts and learned where the power lived in the footnotes, in the definition section, in the subtle clauses that most people never read. Eleanor Thorne was a brutal teacher. Not through cruelty, but through indifference. She didn't explain things twice. She didn't offer encouragement. She simply expected perfection and moved on. But Anya watched everything. She observed how Eleanor negotiated with opposing counsel, using silence as a weapon. She studied how Eleanor structured settlement agreements, creating tripwires that protected her clients years into the future. She absorbed how Eleanor attacked asset protection strategies, finding the weak points where money was vulnerable. "Corporate debt is just storytelling," Eleanor said one day, reviewing a case with Anya. "You tell a story about who owes what to whom, and if your documentation is better than theirs, your story becomes reality. The law doesn't care about truth. It cares about paperwork." Anya filed that lesson away with all the others. At night, in her motel room, she continued her private research on Marcus Vance. His bankruptcy filing had been published, listing his assets and debts. Most of it was incomplete. Companies claimed to have zero value, assets listed as disposed of, holdings described in vague terms, but there were breadcrumbs. Shell companies with generic names, references to international holdings, mentions of intellectual property held by subsidiaries not included in the bankruptcy. Marcus had hidden his wealth, just as she'd expected. The bankruptcy was theatre, a performance designed to satisfy creditors with pennies, while he preserved the real assets offshore. She began building a map of his empire, using public filings, news articles, and corporate registries. It was painstaking work, connecting companies through shared addresses, overlapping board members, and registration dates. But gradually, a picture emerged. At the center of it all was a company called Vance Global Investments Limited. It appeared nowhere in the bankruptcy filing, but it existed registered in Delaware 3 years ago, with Marcus listed as the sole director. Its purpose was listed as investment management and intellectual property holdings. She dug deeper. Vance Global Investments held patents for several of the technologies Marcus had developed: machine learning algorithms, IoT protocols, data optimization processes. Technologies that, once the bankruptcy circus ended and the scrutiny faded, could be quietly licensed or sold for millions. It was his escape hatch, the asset he'd protected while everything else burned. It was also her target. Anya opened a new document on her laptop and began outlining a plan. It was audacious, probably illegal, and would require perfect execution. But she had time now. She had knowledge. She had a weapon, the signature stamp wrapped carefully in her backpack. And she had nothing left to lose. Marcus Vance had taught her how predators operate. Now she would show him what prey could become when backed into a corner. 6 months passed. Anya Petrova, who now went by Anna Peterson in her daily life, had transformed in ways that weren't visible to casual observation. She still looked like the same woman: dark hair, sharp features, the lean build of someone who forgot to eat when focused. But beneath the surface, she'd been systematically rewiring herself, replacing trust with calculation, hope with strategy. The work at Thorne and Associates was brutal in exactly the way she needed. Eleanor Thorne ran her firm, like a military operation, and Anya had embedded herself as an indispensable asset. She arrived before anyone else and left after everyone had gone. She never complained, never made excuses, and never made the same mistake twice. Eleanor noticed. 2 months in, she'd increased Anya's salary to $25 an hour. 4 months in, she'd started assigning her more complex work, drafting preliminary motions, analyzing financial statements, researching case precedents. "You're wasted as a paralegal," Eleanor said one evening, reviewing a brief Anya had prepared. "You think like an attorney. Have you considered law school?" "I don't have time for law school." "No one does. That's why most lawyers are mediocre." Eleanor signed the brief without changing a word the first time Anya had seen her approve something without edits. "If you ever want a recommendation, let me know." But Anya wasn't interested in becoming a lawyer. She was interested in learning how lawyers think, how they weaponize language, how they turn paper into power. Law school would take 3 years she didn't have. Eleanor's tutelage was real-time, practical, and focused on exactly what she needed: the dark arts of corporate warfare. The firm specialized in bankruptcy and asset recovery, which meant their clients were either corporations trying to escape debt or creditors trying to extract blood from stones. Anya learned both sides of the equation. She learned how companies created bankruptcy remote entities to shield assets. She learned about fraudulent conveyance, transferring assets to friendly parties just before bankruptcy to keep them from creditors. She learned about preference actions, lawsuits to claw back payments made to certain creditors before bankruptcy filing. Most importantly, she learned about documentation. Every transaction leaves a paper trail, Eleanor explained during a case review. The question is whether your paper trail is better than theirs. If you can document a transaction convincingly, it becomes real in the eyes of the law. Courts don't care what actually happened. They care what you can prove happened. Anya absorbed this lesson like gospel. She also learned the practical mechanics of corporate structure. She learned how holding companies worked, how subsidiaries could be nested within subsidiaries, how ownership could be obscured through layers of LLCs and trusts. She learned about registered agents and how companies could exist in Delaware or Nevada with minimal disclosure requirements. One case in particular captivated her attention. Thorne and Associates was representing a creditor trying to recover funds from a bankrupt tech company. The debtor had claimed complete insolvency, but Eleanor suspected hidden assets. "Look at the corporate structure," Eleanor instructed, spreading documents across the conference table. "The main company filed bankruptcy, but look at these subsidiaries. 3 of them were transferred to a new holding company 6 months before the filing. The debtor claims they were worthless, but I don't buy it." Anya spent 2 weeks dissecting the structure. She traced the subsidiaries through corporate registries, analyzed their intellectual property holdings, and discovered that the worthless companies held valuable patents that were being quietly licensed through the new holding company. Her memo to Eleanor laid it out in devastating detail. The debtor conducted a fraudulent transfer of valuable assets to evade creditor claims. The subsidiaries were transferred for nominal consideration, $100 each, despite holding patents valued at $8.2m. This constitutes a fraudulent conveyance under Delaware law and should be voidable. Eleanor read the memo twice. Then she looked at Anya with something approaching admiration. This is publishable work. How did you find the patent valuations, USPTO filings, licensing agreements from comparable technologies, and industry reports? The patents are for data compression algorithms. I have a background in software engineering, so I could assess their technical merit. Your background is doing a lot of work in that sentence. Eleanor smiled. A rare expression. Well done. I'm using this entire memo in our motion. With attribution. They won the case. The transfers were voided. The assets were recovered. And Eleanor's client got paid. Anya's name appeared in the court filing as Research Analyst, Thorne and Associates. It was the first time in 8 months that she'd seen her real name in an official document. It felt like reclaiming a small piece of herself. But she wasn't doing this for recognition. She was doing it for education. At night, Anya continued her private investigation of Marcus Vance. The motel room had become a war room, with papers covering every surface, her laptop perpetually open to corporate registries and legal databases. She'd mapped out Vance Global Investments, Limited, in meticulous detail. The company had been registered in Delaware 3 years ago, shortly after Marcus's main empire began showing cracks. It was a textbook asset protection strategy. Create a new entity, transfer valuable holdings before the collapse, and let the old companies fail while the new one survived. Vance Global Investments held 23 patents, mostly related to machine learning and data optimization. She'd analyzed each one, assessing their market value based on comparable licensing deals. Conservative estimate, $12 million. Optimistic estimate, $30 million. Marcus had also transferred several trademarks and domain names to the company brands that had value, independent of the collapsed companies. Another $3 million in assets. The ownership structure was simple. Marcus Vance was listed as the sole director and shareholder. No partners, no other board members. It was his private piggy bank, hidden, in plain sight. The question was how to access it, how to use it against him. The answer came during a case. Eleanor was working on a debt novation dispute. Novation was a legal term Anya had learned early in her paralegal work, but this case illuminated its power. Novation was the process of replacing one party in a contract with another party. It required agreement from all parties, the original debtor, the original creditor, and the new debtor, assuming the obligation. In this case, Company A owed money to Bank B. Company C, owned by Company A's former CEO, had signed a novation agreement, assuming Company A's debt. Except Company C claimed the novation was invalid because they'd never agreed to it. The signature was forged. Eleanor's job was to prove the signature was genuine, which meant analyzing handwriting, notary records, and the circumstances of the signing. Anya reviewed the documents and noticed something interesting. The signature on the novation agreement was identical to other signatures by Company C's CEO. 2 identical. Every loop, every flourish, every pressure point was the same. This is a signature stamp, Anya told Eleanor. Look at the consistency. Human signatures have natural variation. This is mechanically reproduced. Eleanor examined the documents more closely. You're right, but that doesn't mean it's forged. Many executives use signature stamps for routine documents. The question is whether the stamp was used with authorization. How do you prove authorization? Context. If the company's own records show they used the stamp for similar documents, if their board minutes reference its use, if there's a pattern of the stamp appearing on legitimate contracts, then its use is presumed authorized unless proven otherwise. The case settled before trial, but the lesson stayed with Anya. A signature stamp, used in the right context, with the right documentation, was as legally binding as a handwritten signature. That night, she pulled Marcus's signature stamp from her drawer and pressed it onto a piece of paper. The impression was perfect, identical to the signatures she'd found on dozens of legitimate contracts in her research. If she could create the right context, the right documentation, the right corporate records, the right trail of evidence, she could use this stamp to bind Marcus Vance's hidden company to anything she wanted, including her $20 million debt. The plan took shape over the following months. Anya worked her paralegal job during the day, learning everything Eleanor could teach her. At night, she refined her strategy, identifying every component she would need. Phase 1. Create the bridge. She would need a shell company to act as an intermediary. This company would assume her debt from the bank, then transfer it to Vance Global Investments through a Novation agreement. The shell company had to be clean, legitimate, and structured in a way that wouldn't raise suspicions. Phase 2. Document the transaction. She would need to create a paper trail showing that Vance Global Investments had agreed to assume the debt. This meant a debt assumption agreement between her shell company and Vance Global Investments, a Novation agreement showing the bank's consent to the transfer board resolutions from Vance Global Investments authorizing the transaction, internal memos and correspondence, creating a plausible reason for the assumption. Phase 3. Execute the stamp. Marcus Vance's signature would appear on all the critical documents for Vance Global Investments. The signatures would be perfect because they would come from his own stamp. The documents would be dated appropriately, notarized where necessary, and filed in the correct jurisdictions. Phase 4. File and lock. Once the documentation was complete, she would file everything with the bank, get the novation approved, and be released from the debt. Vance Global Investments would become the new debtor, responsible for the $20 million plus interest. Phase 5. The trap. Once Vance Global Investments held the debt, Anya would systematically acquire other debts owed by the company, small debts, distressed debts, anything she could buy, for pennies on the dollar. Then she would call them all in simultaneously, forcing the company into insolvency. And when Vance Global Investments collapsed, its assets, those carefully protected patents and trademarks, would be liquidated. As a major creditor, Anya would be first in line to claim them. It was elegant, brutal, and required perfect execution. One misstep, one document that didn't pass scrutiny, and the entire plan would collapse. But Anya had spent 8 months learning how to make documents perfect. She'd learned from Eleanor Thorne, who never lost cases because her paperwork was always flawless. She'd studied hundreds of contracts, agreements, and corporate filings, absorbing their language and structure. She was ready. The only question was whether she had the nerve to actually do it, to cross the line from victim seeking justice to predator hunting prey. She thought about Marcus Vance, who'd used her trust to destroy her life, who'd vanished without consequence while she fought to survive. She thought about the casual cruelty of powerful men who treated people as disposable assets. And she thought about her grandmother, who'd cleaned houses for 50 years and saved every penny, who'd built a legacy that was supposed to change Anya's life but instead had been stolen by a man who already had everything. Yes, she decided, she had the nerve. Marcus Vance had taught her to be ruthless in business. Now she would show him the difference between a businessman and a predator. One used power for profit, the other used it for destruction. Anya opened a new file on her laptop and titled it Project Reversal. Then she began drafting the first document, Articles of Organization for a Delaware LLC, called Cascade Debt Solutions. The game had begun. The creation of Cascade Debt Solutions took 3 weeks and $1,200 of Anya's carefully saved money. She registered it in Delaware, the same jurisdiction where Marcus had hidden Vance Global Investments, using a registered agent service that provided a legal address and handled state filings. The LLC's stated purpose was debt acquisition, restructuring, and asset recovery services. It was deliberately generic, the kind of company that existed by the thousands in Delaware's corporate registry. Nothing about it would attract attention. She listed herself as the managing member under her legal name, Anya Petrova. There was no point in hiding her identity. The entire strategy depended on creating a legitimate paper trail, and false identities would undermine that. If questioned, she could claim she was trying to resolve her debt through a business restructuring. It was technically true, though it omitted the revenge aspect. Next, she opened a business bank account with a $500 initial deposit. The account needed to be real, functional, and capable of showing transaction in history. She used it to pay the LLC's annual Delaware franchise tax, $300, and to purchase a professional liability insurance policy, $250. These expenses were painful given her limited resources, but they added legitimacy. If anyone scrutinized Cascade Debt Solutions, they would find a functioning company, not a hollow shell. Then came the hardest part: acquiring her own debt. The $20 million loan that had destroyed her life was held by Citizens Commercial Bank. But in the 9 months since the default notice, the bank had written it off as uncollectible. Anya's bankruptcy filings, forced on her by the bank's collection efforts, had shown she had no assets to seize. The bank had added her debt to their portfolio of distressed commercial loans, obligations that existed on paper but would likely never be repaid. Banks hated distressed debt. It tied up capital, required ongoing legal expenses, and generated no revenue. They were motivated to offload these loans, often for pennies, on the dollar, just to clean their books. Anya called the bank's Special Assets Division the department that handled problem loans using her Cascade Debt Solutions business line. "This is Anna Peterson, with Cascade Debt Solutions. I'm interested in purchasing a distressed commercial loan from your portfolio." The representative, sounding bored, asked for details. Anya provided the loan number and account information. "That's a $20 million obligation with a personal guarantor in bankruptcy," the representative said. "Current value assessed at $0. We've already written it off. I'm prepared to purchase the note for $50,000. There was a pause. "Ma'am, the face value is $20 million. The face value is irrelevant if you can't collect it. I'm offering you $50,000 for a loan you've already written off as worthless. That's $50,000 more than you'll get if it stays in your distressed portfolio. I'll need to submit this to our Asset Disposition Committee. Please do. My offer is valid for 10 business days." She hung up and immediately panicked. She didn't have $50,000. She barely had $5,000 after paying for the LLC formation and business expenses. Offering to buy her own debt was a calculated risk. She was gambling that the bank would negotiate, that they were desperate enough to accept less. 3 days later, they called back. "Miss Peterson? We've reviewed your offer. Our committee has approved the sale of the Petrova note at a purchase price of $35,000, provided you can close within 30 days. Anya's heart hammered. $35,000 was still more than she had. But it was negotiable space. "I can close within 30 days at $25,000. Cash payment. No contingencies." Another pause. "I'll need to confirm. Can I call you back?" "Of course." They called back the next day with approval. $25,000. Closing in 30 days. Anya hung up and stared at her laptop screen. She'd just negotiated to purchase her own $20 million debt for $25,000. It was absurd, Kafkaesque, brilliant, and she still didn't have the money. She borrowed it from Eleanor Thorne. The request was humiliating, but necessary. She walked into Eleanor's office late one evening, after everyone else had gone home, and laid out a partial version of the truth. "I need to borrow $25,000. I'll pay you back within 6 months, with 10% interest." Eleanor looked up from her work, expression unreadable. "That's a significant sum. What's it for?" "I'm buying a distressed debt that I believe I can recover on." "You're getting into debt collection?" Eleanor's eyebrow arched. "That's a predatory business. So is what we do here. The only difference is who we're collecting from." Eleanor studied her for a long moment. "This is about Vance, isn't it? The sugar daddy who left you with his debts." Anya had never told Eleanor the full story. But Eleanor wasn't stupid. She'd seen Anya's name on the bankruptcy filings that occasionally crossed her desk, had noticed the intensity with which Anya researched corporate asset protection strategies. "Yes," Anya said simply. It's about him. And you think you can collect from a man who's vanished? I think I can make him wish he'd never met me. Eleanor was quiet for a long time. Then she opened her desk drawer and pulled out a checkbook. I'll loan you $30,000. You'll need the extra for closing costs and fees. 15% interest, payable within 1 year. If you default, you work for me at paralegal wages until it's repaid. That's a terrible deal. It's the only deal you're getting. Do you want it or not? Yes. Thank you. Eleanor wrote the check. Don't make me regret this. And Anna? Whatever you're planning, be smarter than he was. The difference between fraud and strategy is documentation. 30 days later, Cascade Debt Solutions purchased the Petrova note from Citizens Commercial Bank for $25,000. The transaction was documented in a formal note purchase agreement, executed with all the proper legal formalities. The bank transferred the original promissory note and personal guarantee to Cascade Debt Solutions, along with all collection rights. Anya Petrova's debt, the debt that had destroyed her life, was now owned by her own LLC. She was simultaneously the debtor and the creditor, a Mobius strip of obligation. But this wasn't about cancelling the debt. This was about transferring it. Phase 2 began immediately, creating the documentary evidence that would bind Vance Global Investments to her obligation. Anya had studied hundreds of corporate documents at Thorne & Associates, absorbing their language, structure, and internal logic. She knew that convincing documentation wasn't just about forging signatures, it was about creating a complete narrative that made sense in context. She needed to answer the question, why would Vance Global Investments agree to assume a $20 million debt from an unknown LLC? The answer she constructed was elegant: corporate restructuring. She drafted a series of internal memos, ostensibly from Vance Global Investments, documenting a strategic decision to consolidate legacy obligations from related entities. The memos referenced Marcus Vance's earlier ventures, noting that certain debts had been administratively misallocated to individual guarantors rather than corporate entities. The language was deliberately vague, the kind of corporate speak that sounded plausible without saying anything concrete. She included references to tax optimization, balance sheet restructuring, and fiduciary duty to correct historical irregularities. Next, she drafted a board resolution for Vance Global Investments. Delaware law required that major corporate decisions be approved by the board of directors and documented in written resolutions. Since Marcus was the sole director of Vance Global Investments, the resolution only needed his signature. She used his stamp. The resolution authorized Vance Global Investments to assume certain obligations related to prior corporate activities, including but not limited to the debt obligations currently held by Cascade Debt Solutions, as part of a comprehensive restructuring strategy. She dated it 2 weeks earlier and had it notarized using a mobile notary service she found online. The notary watched her stamp the signature, and she explained it was a signature stamp authorized by the company, a common practice. The notary didn't question it. Why would they? Signature stamps were legal and widely used. Then came the debt assumption agreement itself. This was the core document, the one that would transfer her $20 million obligation from Cascade Debt Solutions to Vance Global Investments. She drafted it with meticulous care, using language borrowed from dozens of similar agreements she'd reviewed at Thorne & Associates. The agreement stated that Cascade Debt Solutions currently held the Petrova note. Vance Global Investments agreed to assume the full obligation of the Petrova note, false, but documented. Cascade Debt Solutions agreed to release Anya Petrova from the personal guarantee upon completion of the assumption. The entire point. Vance Global Investments would pay a facilitation fee of $500,000 to Cascade Debt Solutions for structuring the transaction. This was her interest, pure fiction, but it established precedent for later collection. She dated the agreement, used Marcus's stamp on behalf of Vance Global Investments, and signed as managing member of Cascade Debt Solutions. Then she had both signatures notarized again, using a mobile notary who saw nothing suspicious about signature stamps and authorized representatives. The final document was the Novation agreement, the three-party contract between Cascade Debt Solutions, Vance Global Investments, and Citizens Commercial Bank. This was trickier because it required the bank's consent to transfer the obligation to a new debtor. But the bank had already sold the note to Cascade Debt Solutions. Technically, they were no longer a party to the obligation Cascade Debt Solutions was. So Anya drafted the novation as a private agreement between Cascade and Vance Global Investments, with a notice to the bank informing them of the debtor substitution. She wasn't asking for their permission. She was informing them that the debt had been restructured. Would it work? Possibly. The bank had written off the debt and sold it. They had no financial interest in who ultimately owed the money, as long as someone did. If they received paperwork showing that a solvent company, Vance Global Investments, had assumed the obligation from an insolvent individual, Anya Petrova, they might simply update their records and move on. It was audacious, possibly fraudulent, and completely dependent on bureaucratic indifference. She mailed the complete documentation package to Citizens Commercial Bank, certified mail, with a cover letter requesting they update their records to reflect the novation. Then, she waited. 3 weeks later, she received a response from the bank's legal department. Her hands shook as she opened the envelope, expecting a rejection, a threat of prosecution, or worse, nothing at all, which would mean they'd ignored her. Instead, the letter was perfunctory, almost bored. This letter acknowledges receipt of the novation agreement, dated, date, regarding the Petrova note, account number. Our records have been updated to reflect Vance Global Investments, Limited, as the primary obligor on this debt. The personal guarantee of Anya Petrova has been released pursuant to the terms of the agreement. Please direct all future correspondence regarding this obligation to Vance Global Investments at the address on file. Anya read it 3 times, then a 4th. Then she laughed a sharp, slightly hysterical sound. It had worked. The bank had accepted the documentation without question. Why wouldn't they? The paperwork was perfect, the signatures were legally notarized, and the transaction solved their problem by moving the debt from an uncollectible individual to a corporate entity. They didn't care that Marcus Vance had never actually agreed to assume the debt. They didn't care that the entire transaction was orchestrated by the very person whose debt was being transferred. They cared about paperwork, and her paperwork was flawless. Anya Petrova was free. The $20 million debt that had destroyed her life no longer existed. Not for her. Now, it belonged to Marcus Vance. Or more specifically, to Vance Global Investments, the company he'd hidden to protect his wealth, the company that held his valuable patents and trademarks, the company that was about to become very, very vulnerable. Anya pulled out her laptop and opened a new file. Phase 5? The trap. She wasn't done. Not even close. The release from her debt should have felt liberating, but Anya felt only cold satisfaction. She'd successfully transferred the $20 million obligation to Vance Global Investments through a combination of legal maneuvering and Marcus's own signature stamp. But that was defensive, protecting herself. Now came the offensive strike. She needed to weaponize the debt. The problem was that Vance Global Investments, while now technically responsible for $20 million plus the fictitious $500,000 facilitation fee, wasn't currently being pursued by creditors. The bank had written off the debt and wasn't actively collecting. As far as they were concerned, the matter was closed. Bad debt transferred to a corporate entity that would probably never pay. But Anya wasn't interested in the bank collecting. She was interested in creating a crisis that would force Vance Global Investments into insolvency, triggering a liquidation of its assets. To do that, she needed to become a creditor with enforcement power. Not just any creditor, the primary creditor, with the legal standing to demand payment and initiate bankruptcy proceedings if the company defaulted. That meant restructuring the debt one more time. Cascade Debt Solutions still nominally held the Petrova note, even though the obligation had been transferred to Vance Global Investments. Anya drafted a new agreement, this time between Cascade Debt Solutions and Vance Global Investments, converting the assumed debt into a formal, secured promissory note. The new note had several key features. Principal amount, $20 million, $500,000. The original $20M plus. The $500K. Facilitation fee. Interest rate. 12% per annum. Aggressive, but not usurious. Payment terms. Balloon payment due in 90 days. Security interest. Secured by all assets, intellectual property, and holdings of Vance Global Investments, Limited. Default provisions. Upon default, creditor could demand immediate liquidation and had first priority claim on all assets. The terms were deliberately harsh, designed to be impossible to meet. Vance Global Investments was a holding company with no cash flow, only assets, patents and trademarks. It couldn't make a $20 million balloon payment, which meant it would default the moment the note came due. Anya signed the note as managing member of Cascade Debt Solutions. Then she used Marcus's stamp to sign on behalf of Vance Global Investments, dating it appropriately and having it notarized. The document was beautiful in its lethality. Marcus Vance's own signature had just bound his hidden company to an impossible debt, secured by the very assets he'd protected. But there was still a vulnerability in her plan. Marcus could claim the signature was forged, that he'd never authorized these transactions, that the entire structure was fraudulent, which was why she needed to bury the fraudulent documents under a mountain of legitimate ones. Over the next month, Anya created a paper trail that would make the secured promissory note appear routine, even inevitable. She drafted a series of backdated internal documents for Vance Global Investments, all using Marcus's stamp. Corporate minutes. Quarterly board meetings, with Marcus as the sole attendee, discussing debt restructuring initiatives and optimizing the corporate balance sheet. Internal memos. Strategy documents referencing the need to consolidate legacy obligations and formalize outstanding debts to improve credit standing. Correspondence. Letters from Vance Global Investments to Cascade Debt Solutions, discussing the terms of the restructuring, negotiating interest rates, and confirming the security interest. Each document was professional, boring, and utterly mundane, the kind of paperwork that corporations generated constantly. She printed them on company letterhead she'd recreated using Marcus's old templates. She included typos and formatting inconsistencies that made them look authentically rushed. Then, she filed everything. She sent copies to Vance Global Investments' registered agent in Delaware, who was required to maintain corporate records. She sent copies to the Delaware Secretary of State, along with the UCC, one financing statement, a public filing that established Cascade Debt Solutions' security interest in Vance Global Investments' assets. The UCC one was critical. It was a public record, searchable by anyone, that announced to the world, Cascade Debt Solutions has a secured interest in all assets of Vance Global Investments, Limited. If Marcus ever tried to sell those assets, if he ever tried to license those patents, any buyer would discover the security interest and know the assets were encumbered. She'd effectively placed a lien on his entire hidden fortune. The next phase required patience. Anya went back to her paralegal work at Thorne & Associates, maintaining the routine that had sustained her for the past year. Eleanor never asked about the loan, though she occasionally gave Anya appraising looks, as if trying to determine what scheme she was running. Meanwhile, Anya began quietly acquiring other debts related to Vance Global Investments. This was the trickiest part. Vance Global Investments was a private company with minimal public footprint. But Anya had learned, through her deep research, that the company had engaged in a handful of transactions over the years. Licensing deals, consulting agreements, vendor contracts. Some of those transactions had left behind unpaid obligations. A graphic design firm in San Jose was owed $12,000 for branding work. A patent attorney in New York was owed $28,000 for legal services. A cloud hosting provider was owed $6,500 for server costs. These were small debts, ignored or forgotten in the chaos of Marcus's larger bankruptcy. The creditors had written them off, assumed they'd never collect, and moved on. Anya contacted each of them through Cascade Debt Solutions, offering to buy the debts. "I'm a debt recovery specialist," she explained. "I'm willing to purchase your outstanding receivable from Vance Global Investments at a discount. You'll get paid immediately, and I'll handle collection. The graphic design firm sold her the $12,000 debt for $1,500. The patent attorney sold the $28,000 debt for $5,000. The hosting provider sold the $6,500 debt for $800. She was spending Eleanor's loan money, carefully documented through Cascade Debt Solutions, acquiring distressed obligations for pennies on the dollar. Within 2 months, she'd accumulated $68,000 in face value debt owed by Vance Global Investments, purchased for a total cost of $9,400. None of these debts alone would threaten the company, but combined with her $20.5 million secured promissory note, they created a critical mass. She was now the overwhelming primary creditor, with legal standing to demand payment and force bankruptcy if the company defaulted. And default was inevitable, because the 90-day balloon payment on her note was now due. Anya drafted a formal demand letter, printed on Cascade Debt Solutions letterhead, and sent it to Vance Global Investments via certified mail. Dear Mr. Vance, this letter constitutes formal demand for payment of the secured promissory note, dated date, in the principal amount of $20,500,000, plus accrued interest of $615,000, calculated at 12% per annum for 90 days, for a total amount due of $21,115,000. Per the terms of the note, payment was due on date. As of today's date, Vance Global Investments, Limited, is in default. Pursuant to Section 5B of the note, the entire outstanding balance is now immediately due and payable. Additionally, Cascade Debt Solutions holds additional obligations owed by Vance Global Investments, totaling $68,000, also currently in default. This letter serves as your final notice before we initiate legal proceedings to enforce our security interest and pursue liquidation of all assets of Vance Global Investments, Limited. Payment must be received within 15 days of the date of this letter. Failure to remit payment will result in immediate legal action. Sincerely, Anya Petrova, Managing Member, Cascade Debt Solutions. She mailed it to Vance Global Investments' registered agent address in Delaware, knowing it would be forwarded to wherever Marcus was hiding. Then she mailed a second letter, this one to Marcus's personal attorney, the one listed in his bankruptcy filings, as representing him in the Vance Industries collapse. And then she waited. The response came 3 weeks later, not from Marcus, but from his attorney. The letter was aggressive, threatening, and exactly what she'd expected. Miss Peterson, my client, Mr. Marcus Vance, has received your demand letter regarding alleged obligations of Vance Global Investments Limited. Mr. Vance categorically denies the validity of these claims. The secured promissory note you reference was not authorized by Mr. Vance. The signature on said document is fraudulent. Additionally, the underlying debt assumption agreements and Novation documents were never approved by Mr. Vance or any authorized representative of Vance Global Investments. We believe these documents constitute fraud and forgery. We are prepared to report this matter to law enforcement and pursue civil remedies against you and any entities you control. Furthermore, Vance Global Investments disputes the validity of your UCC-1 filing and demands its immediate release. Cease all collection activities immediately. Any further contact will be considered harassment and will result in legal action. Sincerely, Robert Chen, Esquire Attorney for Marcus Vance. Anya read the letter twice, then smiled. They were panicking. Marcus had discovered that his hidden company, the sanctuary where he'd protected his wealth, was suddenly encumbered with $21 million in debt. He discovered that his own signature appeared on documents he'd never signed. He discovered that a creditor he didn't recognize had a legal claim on all his assets. And he was claiming fraud. Perfect. Anya drafted her response carefully. Mr. Chen, thank you for your letter dated date. I am confused by your claims of fraud and forgery. The secured promissory note was executed by Mr. Vance using his authorized signature stamp, which is maintained by Vance Global Investments for routine corporate documents. The use of signature stamps is standard practice in corporate governance and is legally recognized in Delaware. Furthermore, the underlying transactions, debt assumption agreement, and novation agreement were properly authorized by board resolutions of Vance Global Investments, copies of which are attached. These resolutions were executed by Mr. Vance, in his capacity as sole director of the company. All documents were properly notarized and filed with the appropriate authorities. Citizens Commercial Bank accepted and processed the novation without objection. The Delaware Secretary of State accepted and recorded our UCC-1 filing without objection. If Mr. Vance is claiming that his own signature stamp was used without authorization, he will need to explain how his corporate seal, letterhead, and internal documents were also compromised. He will also need to explain why his company's registered agent accepted and maintained these documents in the official corporate record. I suspect a more plausible explanation is that Mr. Vance authorized these transactions during his company's restructuring efforts and has now forgotten about them, or is attempting to evade legitimate obligations. We have no intention of ceasing collection activities. Vance Global Investments is in default, and we are entitled to enforce our security interest. If Mr. Vance wishes to dispute these obligations, he is welcome to do so in court. We look forward to presenting our documentation to a judge. Sincerely, Anya Petrova, Managing Member, Cascade Debt Solutions. She attached copies of all the fabricated board resolutions, internal memos, and corporate minutes, the paper trail she'd meticulously constructed. The strategy was simple: dare him to sue. Because if Marcus Vance took this to court, he would have to explain how his signature stamp ended up being used without his knowledge. He would have to explain why his company's official records contained documents he claimed were fraudulent. He would have to explain why he'd hidden Vance Global Investments in the first place, shielding it from his bankruptcy proceedings. And most devastatingly, he would have to explain the original sin: how Anya Petrova's signature ended up on a personal guarantee for $20 million she never understood she was signing. Discovery would be brutal. For both of them, yes, but far more so for him. Because Anya had nothing left to lose, and Marcus was still trying to protect his hidden assets. She mailed the response and waited. A month passed with no reply. Then 2 months. Marcus's attorney had gone silent, which meant they'd recognize the trap. If they sued, they'd expose everything. If they didn't sue, Cascade Debt Solutions could proceed with enforcement. On the 91st day after her demand letter, Anya filed a lawsuit in Delaware Chancery Court. Cascade Debt Solutions, LLC Vance Global Investments Limited. Action to enforce security interest and demand asset liquidation. The lawsuit demanded immediate payment of the $21.1 million debt, plus legal fees, or, alternatively, the liquidation of Vance Global Investments assets to satisfy the obligation. Marcus Vance had 30 days to respond. Anya had learned from Eleanor Thorne that most legal battles were won before trial, through superior documentation and strategic positioning. She'd built an impenetrable paper fortress around Marcus's hidden company. Every document was notarized, filed, and cross-referenced. Every signature came from his own stamp, used in a way that was technically legal, if morally dubious. The question wasn't whether she would win. The question was how much she could take from him before he realized he'd already lost. The lawsuit hit Marcus Vance like a financial missile. Within days of the filing, his attorney called Anya directly a violation of protocol that suggested panic. "Miss Peterson, this is Robert Chen. We need to discuss settlement terms." Anya let the silence stretch before responding. "I thought my claims were fraudulent. Why would you want to settle a fraudulent lawsuit?" "My client disputes the validity of certain documents, but he's willing to negotiate in good faith to resolve this matter quickly." "How generous. What are you offering?" "Mr. Vance is prepared to pay $500,000 to release all claims against Vance Global Investments and remove the UCC-1 filing." Anya laughed. Actually laughed into the phone. $500,000. The face value of the debt is $21.1 million. Your client owes more than that. Miss Peterson, we both know these documents are questionable. If this goes to trial, you risk criminal prosecution for forgery and fraud. My client is offering you an exit that allows you to walk away whole. Alternatively, your client risks discovery. That will expose how he transferred assets to Vance Global Investments to shield them from bankruptcy, how he forged my signature on a $20 million personal guarantee, and how he's been hiding income from creditors. Should we discuss which of us has more to lose? Another long silence. Then, what do you want? I want what I'm owed. $21.1 million plus interest, or the liquidation of Vance Global Investments assets to satisfy the debt. Those are the terms of the note your client signed. He'll never agree to that. Then I'll see you in court. Discovery starts in 60 days. I'm looking forward to deposing Mr. Vance about his signature stamp, his corporate structure, and his relationship with me. I'm sure those depositions will make fascinating reading. She hung up. Marcus didn't respond to the lawsuit within the required 30 days, which meant he defaulted. Anya immediately filed for a default judgment, and the Delaware Chancery Court, notorious for its efficiency and deference to contract law, granted it. The judgment was brutal and comprehensive. Vance Global Investments, Limited, owed Cascade Debt Solutions $21,115,000, plus accrued interest. Cascade Debt Solutions' security interest in all assets of Vance Global Investments was valid and enforceable. Vance Global Investments was Cascade Debt Solutions, ordered to liquidate assets to satisfy the judgment within 90 days. Failure to comply would result in involuntary bankruptcy proceedings. Anya had won by forfeit. Marcus's strategy of hiding, of refusing to engage, had backfired spectacularly. By defaulting, he'd allowed the court to accept her documentation without challenge. Now she had a court judgment, a legal weapon that transformed her fabricated debt into an enforceable obligation. But Anya wasn't satisfied with a judgment that Vance Global Investments couldn't pay. She didn't want Marcus to simply dissolve the company and walk away. She wanted to strip every asset he'd hidden, to dismantle his sanctuary piece by piece. That required forcing the company into bankruptcy, but strategic bankruptcy, where she controlled the process. She filed an involuntary bankruptcy petition against Vance Global Investments under Chapter 11 of the U.S. Bankruptcy Code. An involuntary bankruptcy was rare. It required creditors to prove the debtor was insolvent and unable to pay debts as they came due. Anya had no trouble proving either. She submitted the default judgment, showing $21.1 million in unpaid debt. She submitted the smaller debts she'd acquired, $68,000 total, all currently in default. She demonstrated that Vance Global Investments had no cash flow, no employees, and no operations-only assets. The company was a classic, asset-rich, cash-poor entity, unable to pay its obligations despite holding valuable property. The bankruptcy court accepted the petition. Vance Global Investments was now in Chapter 11 bankruptcy, and a trustee was appointed to oversee the proceedings. Marcus's attorney filed an emergency motion to dismiss the bankruptcy, arguing it was brought in bad faith by a creditor with fraudulent claims. But Anya had anticipated this. She submitted the entire paper trail, corporate minutes, board resolutions, notarized agreements, the bank's acknowledgement of the novation, the court judgment. The bankruptcy judge reviewed the documentation and denied the motion. The debtor has presented no evidence that these obligations are invalid, beyond bare assertions. The creditor has a court judgment. The bankruptcy proceeds. In Chapter 11 bankruptcy, creditors formed a committee to oversee the liquidation of assets. As the largest creditor by far, Anya was appointed to the committee, effectively giving her control over how Vance Global Investments would be dismantled. The company's assets were substantial: 23 patents related to machine learning, data optimization, and IoT protocols. Appraised value: $8.2 million trademarks and domain names for various tech brands. Appraised value: $2.1 million source code repositories for proprietary software. Appraised value: $1.8 million. Contractual rights to licensing agreements. Appraised value: $600,000. Total: approximately $12.7 million in assets. Not enough to cover the $21.1 million debt, but more than enough to make Anya whole and to destroy Marcus in the process. The bankruptcy trustee scheduled an asset auction. All intellectual property would be sold to the highest bidder. with proceeds distributed to creditors, according to priority. As a secured creditor, with a first priority lien, Anya would be paid first. She would receive 100% of the liquidation proceeds until her debt was satisfied. Any remaining funds would go to unsecured creditors, the small debts she'd acquired. Marcus, as the equity holder, would receive nothing. His hidden fortune, the wealth he protected while his other companies collapsed, would be liquidated to pay a debt he never actually agreed to. The auction was held online, managed by a specialized intellectual property brokerage. Anya monitored the bidding from her apartment, watching as tech companies and patent trolls competed for Marcus's innovations. The patents sold quickly. A consortium of AI companies bought the machine learning algorithms for $7.1 million. A cybersecurity firm bought the IoT protocols for $1.4 million. The trademarks and domains sold piecemeal for a total of $1.9 million. The source code repositories were more difficult. Many buyers were wary of acquiring code without documentation or support. They eventually sold for $800,000, below the appraised value. Total proceeds, $11.2 million. After legal fees, trustee fees, and administrative costs, the net available for creditors was $10.4 million. Cascade Debt Solutions, as the first priority secured creditor, received the full $10.4 million. Anya had turned her fabricated $20.5 million debt into a real $10.4 million payment. She'd recovered not just her original losses, but far more of 160%. Return on the $250,000 in combined expenses. Buying the original debt, forming the LLC, acquiring the smaller debts. The other creditors, the graphic design firm, the patent attorney, the hosting provider, received nothing. Their debts were unsecured and subordinate. Anya briefly considered paying them from her windfall, but decided against it. They'd sold their debts to her voluntarily. They'd gotten their money. Marcus Vance got nothing. His hidden company was dissolved, its assets liquidated, its value extracted. But Anya wasn't quite finished. There was still the matter of the interest she'd promised herself, the extra pain she intended to inflict. She used $2 million of her windfall to hire a forensic accounting firm. She gave them a single task: find every asset Marcus Vance still controlled, every account he'd hidden, every offshore trust he'd established. The forensic accountants were expensive, but thorough. They discovered 3 additional shell companies registered in the Cayman Islands, each holding bank accounts with funds Marcus had siphoned from his collapsed businesses before bankruptcy. Total value, approximately $4.3 million. They also discovered that Marcus had purchased a villa in Portugal under a nominee's name, a country with favorable tax treatment and no extradition treaty with the United States for financial crimes. Anya compiled all this information into a comprehensive report and submitted it to the bankruptcy trustee overseeing the Vance Industries bankruptcy, the original, larger bankruptcy from his main companies. These assets were concealed from the bankruptcy estate, her cover letter explained. They should be recovered and distributed to creditors. The trustee launched an investigation. Within months, the offshore accounts were frozen, and the Portuguese villa was seized. Marcus's remaining hidden wealth, the final scraps of his empire, were clawed back and distributed to the hundreds of creditors he'd defrauded. Anya didn't benefit financially from this. The assets went to other victims, but she didn't care about the money at this point. She cared about watching Marcus Vance lose everything, piece by piece, in exactly the way he'd made her lose everything. She paid Eleanor Thorne back in full $30,000 plus $4,500 in interest, 3 months ahead of schedule. Eleanor accepted the check with a slight smile. Successful debt recovery? I take it? Very successful. I'm impressed. Most people in your position would have collapsed into victimhood. You turned it into warfare. You taught me well. I taught you law. The ruthlessness was already there. Eleanor paused. What will you do now? Anya had been considering this question. She had approximately $7.8 million remaining after paying Eleanor, covering legal expenses, and setting aside taxes. It was more money than she'd ever imagined, having more than her grandmother's entire lifetime of savings, multiplied 30 times over. She could retire. She could disappear. She could return to engineering. to the simple work of writing code and solving technical problems. But she'd discovered something about herself over the past 18 months. She was good at this. Not just competent, but exceptional. She understood corporate warfare at a level most people never reached. She knew how to weaponize documentation, how to exploit legal structures, how to turn paper into power. And she knew there were others like her, people who'd been betrayed by those they trusted, destroyed by predators who faced no consequences. "I'm going to start an investment firm," she said. "I'm going to fund companies that build real things, ethical companies, run by people who value their employees and their customers. And I'm going to specialize in asset recovery for fraud victims." Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "That's a surprisingly noble use of ill-gotten gains." "The gains aren't ill-gotten. They're recovered. There's a difference." "Is there?" "You forged documents, fabricated debts, and used a stolen signature stamp. A prosecutor could make a compelling fraud case against you. They could try, but they'd have to explain why they're prosecuting someone who recovered assets stolen from her, while the man who actually committed fraud walks free. It's not a case they'd want to bring." Eleanor nodded slowly. "You've thought this through." "I've thought about nothing else, for 18 months. Anya left Thorne and Associates 3 weeks later, parting on good terms. Eleanor gave her a recommendation letter that described her as the most strategically brilliant paralegal I've ever employed, with an exceptional talent for complex financial analysis. She used part of her windfall to rent a small office in downtown Sacramento and registered a new company, Petrova Capital Management. Its stated purpose was venture capital investment and distressed asset recovery. She hired a small staff, a CPA, a junior attorney, and an analyst. She built a website that carefully described her services, investing in ethical tech startups, with a specialty in helping fraud victims recover assets. The website included a photograph of her, professional, composed, with dark eyes that had seen things and survived them. The caption read, "Anya Petrova, founder and managing partner." She was no longer hiding. She was no longer Anna Peterson, the paralegal working in obscurity. She was Anya Petrova, survivor, strategist, and someone you did not want as an enemy. Her first client was a woman in her 30s who'd been defrauded by her business partner. The partner had transferred their company's assets to an offshore trust and filed bankruptcy, leaving her with nothing. Anya took the case. She spent 3 months untangling the corporate structure, tracing the assets, and building a paper trail that exposed the fraud. Then she engineered a legal strategy that pierced the trust, recovered the assets, and left the partner facing criminal charges. Her client got $1.2 million back. Anya charged a 25% contingency fee standard for asset recovery work. Word spread. Marcus Vance, meanwhile, was discovered living in Portugal, in a modest apartment in Lisbon. The villa had been seized, his offshore accounts drained, his companies dissolved. He was 63 years old, broke, and facing multiple civil lawsuits from creditors who were still pursuing him. He gave one interview to a tech industry podcast where he painted himself as a victim of circumstance. Markets had turned, ventures had failed, he'd made mistakes but never acted with malice. The interviewer asked about Anya Petrova. "She was someone I tried to help," Marcus said, his voice carefully modulated. "I mentored her, invested in her. I'm saddened that she's chosen to make me a villain in her narrative. I wish her well." Anya listened to the interview once, then deleted it. His words were meaningless, the final performance of a man who'd lost the ability to hurt anyone. She never spoke to him again. She never sought him out, never confronted him, never gave him the satisfaction of knowing how much rage she'd carried. Instead, she built her empire with the pieces of his, creating something that would outlast his memory. 3 years after the lawsuit that destroyed Vance Global Investments, Anya Petrova stood in a conference room on the 32nd floor of a San Francisco high-rise, looking out over the city that had once chewed her up and left her to drown. She was 32 years old. Her company, Petrova Capital Management, had grown from a one-woman operation into a formidable investment firm with $140 million in assets under management. She'd built a reputation as someone who invested in ethical companies, but also as someone you absolutely did not cross. The tech world had a long memory, and the story of how she dismantled Marcus Vance's hidden empire had become legend. Most people didn't know the exact details: the signature stamp, fabricated documents, the meticulous fraud she'd engineered, but they knew the outline. A young woman, betrayed by her mentor, left with his debts, who'd somehow reversed the situation and taken everything from him. Some called her brilliant, others called her ruthless. A few whispered that she was dangerous, that her methods were questionable, that she operated in ethical grey zones that made people uncomfortable. Anya didn't care about any of those assessments. She cared about results. Today's meeting was with the founders of a promising AI startup, 2 women in their 20s, who'd developed a machine learning framework for medical diagnostics. They were seeking Series A funding, $3 million for 15% equity. Anya had reviewed their pitch deck, their technology, and their financials. The company was solid, the founders were competent, and the market opportunity was genuine. It was exactly the kind of investment she wanted to make: real technology, solving real problems, built by people who valued integrity. But she'd also done something else. She'd investigated the founders' backgrounds, looking for red flags. Did they have business partners who might betray them? Were they vulnerable to exploitation by more powerful players? Had they signed agreements they didn't fully understand? This was her standard due diligence now. She didn't just evaluate businesses, she evaluated the people behind them, looking for the patterns of predation she'd experienced firsthand. The founders, Sarah Chen and Amara Okafor, sat across from her, nervous but determined. "Your technology is impressive," Anya said. "Your revenue projections are conservative, which I appreciate. But I need to ask you about your corporate structure." Sarah blinked. "Our structure? We're a standard Delaware corp, set up by our attorney." "Who chose the attorney?" We found them through a referral from an advisor." "And who's the advisor?" Amara glanced at Sarah. "Jason Harding. He's a former VC, who's been helping us navigate fundraising." Anya pulled out a folder. "Jason Harding sits on the board of 3 different companies that went bankrupt in the past 5 years, leaving their founders with nothing while he walked away with his advisory fees. He also has a pattern of recommending attorneys who structure cap tables to benefit later investors at the expense of founders." The room went silent. Sarah's face had gone pale. We didn't know that. Most people don't. They trust advisors because advisors present themselves as mentors. That's how exploitation works." Anya slid the folder across the table. "I've had my attorney review your corporate documents. You've given Harding 2% equity as an advisory fee, plus a board seat with veto power over major decisions." "That's a terrible deal." "He told us it was standard," Amara said quietly. "It's not. It's predatory. He's positioning himself to control your company while contributing minimal value." Anya leaned back. "Here's my offer. I'll invest $3 million for 15% equity, as you requested. But you need to remove Harding from your board and buy back his equity at cost. I'll fund the buyback as part of the investment." Sarah looked stricken. "He's going to be furious." "He will be. But he'll also know he can't fight this, because I'll bury him in litigation if he tries. I've done it before." Anya's expression softened slightly. "I'm not trying to scare you. I'm trying to protect you. The tech world is full of people who will take advantage of founders, especially young women. You need to be ruthless about guarding your company, or someone will take it from you." Amara met her gaze directly. "Is that what happened to you?" Anya paused. She didn't usually discuss her past with founders, but there was something in Amara's question, a recognition of shared experience, an understanding that this advice came from scars, not theory. "Yes," she said simply. "Someone I trusted destroyed me financially. I spent 2 years rebuilding and making sure he could never do it to anyone else. Now I help people avoid the same mistakes I made. By being scarier than the predators?" Sarah asked. "By being smarter than them. Scarier is just a side effect." Anya smiled faintly. "So, do you want my investment or not?" They did. That evening, Anya returned to her office and found an email waiting from an unexpected source. Eleanor Thorne. The subject line read, "Interesting news. Anya. Thought you'd want to know. Marcus Vance has been arrested. Portuguese authorities detained him yesterday on charges of tax evasion and fraudulent financial reporting. Apparently he was running a consulting business under a false name, advising startups on growth strategies while skimming client funds. The complaint was filed by two entrepreneurs he defrauded women in their 20s who lost their entire seed round to his scheme. They hired a lawyer who traced his history and connected him to his past in the US. He's facing extradition proceedings. If he's sent back to the States, there are at least a dozen creditors waiting to sue him. I thought you'd appreciate the irony. He's being taken down by the same pattern he used on you, except this time his victims had someone who taught them how to fight back. Well done." Eleanor Anya read the email twice. Then she closed her laptop and walked to the window of her office, looking out over Sacramento's modest skyline. She felt nothing, no satisfaction, no vindication, no pleasure. Marcus Vance's arrest was simply the inevitable conclusion of a man who'd never learned that actions had consequences. He'd spent his life exploiting people weaker than himself, and eventually he'd targeted the wrong people. She'd been one of those wrong people. The women in Portugal were more. Perhaps that was her legacy. Not just surviving Marcus Vance, but teaching others how to survive men like him. 6 months later, Anya received a phone call from an attorney in New York. "Miss Petrova, my name is David Castellanos. I represent a class of creditors in the Marcus Vance bankruptcy proceedings. I understand you are one of his victims." "I was involved with Vance Global Investments," Anya said carefully. "Why are you calling?" "We're finalizing the distribution of recovered assets from his offshore accounts and the Portuguese property seizure. According to our records, you had a personal guarantee on a $20 million loan that was later discharged through a Novation agreement with Vance Global Investments." "That's correct. The bankruptcy trustee has classified you as a victim of Vance's fraudulent schemes. You're entitled to a distribution from the recovered assets. Your share would be approximately $280,000. Anya almost laughed. $280,000, a fraction of what she'd lost. An insignificant amount compared to what she'd recovered through her own methods. "Donate it," she said. "I'm sorry?" "Donate my share to an organization that helps women in tech." "I don't need it." There was a pause. "Are you certain?" "It's a significant sum." "I'm certain." "Use it for something useful." She hung up and returned to her work. The final chapter of the Marcus Vance story came a year later, in an article published by TechCrunch, The Fall of Marcus Vance. How a Silicon Valley darling became a cautionary tale. The article was comprehensive, interviewing dozens of people Marcus had defrauded over his career. It traced his rise in the tech world, his pattern of exploiting relationships, and his eventual collapse. It mentioned Anya by name, describing her as a former protégé who successfully recovered her losses through aggressive legal action against Vance's hidden companies. It didn't include the details, the signature stamp, the fabricated documents, the elegant fraud she'd engineered. Those details remained buried in sealed court records and her own memory. The article concluded, Marcus Vance is currently serving a 3-year sentence in Portugal for tax evasion. He will likely face additional charges upon extradition to the United States. His net worth is estimated at $0. Meanwhile, several of his former victims have gone on to successful careers, including venture capitalist Anya Petrova, who now invests in ethical tech startups with a focus on protecting founders from exploitative relationships. Anya read the article once and filed it away. Then, she returned to her work, reviewing a pitch deck for a cybersecurity startup, preparing for a board meeting, and mentoring a young founder who'd asked for advice on navigating a predatory term sheet. She was no longer defined by what Marcus Vance had done to her. She was defined by what she'd built from the ruins he'd left behind. 5 years after the lawsuit that changed her life, Anya Petrova gave a keynote speech at a Women in Tech conference in San Francisco. The organizers had invited her to discuss resilience and recovery in the face of professional betrayal. She stood on stage in front of 300 women, many of them young founders and engineers who'd experienced their own versions of betrayal, stolen ideas, broken partnerships, Exploitation by those they trusted. People always ask me how I recovered, Anya began. They want a simple answer. Therapy, meditation, moving on. But recovery isn't passive. It's not something that happens to you. It's something you do, strategically and relentlessly. She clicked to the next slide. A photograph of a corporate document. Anonymous and boring. This is a signature. It's just ink on paper. But it has power. The power to bind you to obligations you don't understand. The power to transfer wealth. To create debt. To destroy lives. Every document you sign is a weapon that can be used against you. Another click. A diagram of a complex corporate structure. This is how power protects itself through layers of entities, through offshore trusts, through structures designed to obscure accountability. If you want to fight power, you need to understand how it operates. You need to learn the language of law, the mechanics of finance, the architecture of exploitation. Another click. A courtroom photograph. And this is where battles are won or lost, not in the court of public opinion, not in social media threads, but in the boring, procedural world of litigation. Documentation beats emotion. Strategy beats outrage. Patience beats anger. She paused, scanning the audience. When someone powerful betrays you, you have two choices. You can collapse into victimhood, or you can become ungovernable. You can learn how they hurt you, and use that knowledge to ensure they can never hurt anyone else. You can turn their weapons against them. A hand went up in the audience. Isn't that just revenge? Maybe, Anya said. But revenge and justice often look the same from the outside. The difference is documentation. If you can prove your case, if you can build an airtight, legal strategy, if you can weaponize the same systems they used against you, then it's not revenge, it's accountability. Another hand. What happened to the person who betrayed you? Anya smiled slightly. He lost everything. His companies, his wealth, his reputation, his freedom. Not because I destroyed him emotionally, but because I understood his systems better than he did. I used his own signature to dismantle his empire. The audience was silent, hanging on every word. Here's what I want you to remember, Anya said. Power isn't magic. It's not inherent. It's built on structures, legal entities, financial instruments, documented agreements. If you understand those structures, you can navigate them. And if you can navigate them, you can win. She clicked to her final slide, the Petrova Capital logo. I built my firm on that principle. I invest in founders who value integrity, and I protect them from predators. Because I know what it's like to be prey, and I know what it takes to become the predator instead. The applause was thunderous. After the conference, Anya sat in the hotel bar with a glass of wine, alone with her thoughts. A woman approached one of the conference attendees, probably in her mid-20s, with the nervous energy of someone working up courage. Miss Petrova, I'm sorry to bother you. I just wanted to say your talk was incredible. I've been dealing with a situation where my co-founder has been stealing from our company, and I didn't know how to fight back. But listening to you, I realized I've been approaching this all wrong. I've been trying to reason with him, to appeal to his conscience. But he doesn't have one. No, Anya said. He probably doesn't. So what do I do? Anya studied the young woman, the desperation, the anger, the fear. She saw herself at 26, sitting in an apartment with a default notice, her world collapsing. You document everything, she said. Every transaction, every conversation, every decision he made. Then you hire a lawyer who specializes in partnership disputes. Then you sue him, and you don't stop until you've recovered what he took. I can't afford a lawyer. Find one who works on contingency. If your case is strong, they'll take it. The woman nodded slowly. Did you ever regret it? Going after him the way you did? Anya considered the question. Did she regret fabricating documents, using Marcus's signature stamp, engineering an elaborate fraud to dismantle his hidden company? No, she said finally. I regret trusting him in the first place. I regret not seeing the warning signs. But I don't regret fighting back. The world doesn't punish powerful men who exploit others. Someone has to. The woman smiled a small, fierce smile that reminded Anya of herself. Thank you, she said, and walked away. That night, alone in her hotel room, Anya pulled out a small wooden box from her luggage. Inside was Marcus Vance's signature stamp, the weapon she'd used to destroy him. She'd kept it as a reminder not of him, but of what she'd been capable of when pushed to the edge. It was a small thing, unassuming, just wood and rubber. But in the right hands, with the right strategy, it had been powerful enough to topple an empire. She turned it over in her hands, then wrapped it carefully and placed it back in the box. She would keep it, not as a trophy, but as a tool. Because somewhere out there was another Marcus Vance, another predator exploiting someone weaker. And when that person needed help, when they needed someone who understood how to fight back, Anya would be ready. She wasn't the scared, betrayed woman she'd been 5 years ago. She'd been forged in the fire of Marcus's betrayal, tempered by 18 months of brutal self-education, and sharpened by the satisfaction of watching him lose everything. She was Anya Petrova, survivor, strategist, predator, and she was just getting started.